I think just in the macro sense, there are going to be a bunch of companies that do 5, 10, 20% work, and they just decide it's not worth, like, I'm just going to go to other industries. It's not worth the expense. So there's going to be a drop in the DIBS supply base anyway. Maybe folks that are just getting close to retirement, like, this is just too much. But it's going to be an opportunity for the shops that do aggressively go after it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that happen a lot with with demographics of people retiring. There's a lot of what I call the baby primes, where they've grown pretty rapidly. The Blue Halos of the world, some of the other companies that are based out of Southern California, where I'm at, where they've been snapping up companies and manufacturers, and they're now becoming pretty sizable companies, winning a lot of work from inheriting those books of businesses.
It might be harder to turn the Titanic, like harder to take a big company that's got all these different processes and all these different non-CMMC kind of DNA and how they've built their whole company. It might be harder to fix that than it would be to just acquire a smaller company that already has it all.
Yeah.
Jacob, CMMC Town Crier, I think, right?
Yeah, that's the current quippy title that I have on my LinkedIn page.
I like that.
Just whenever I think of something in the shower that seems funny, I just update my LinkedIn title because
that.
my LinkedIn title's completely made up.
So what is a town crier? So, the biggest wuss in the town who's crying about everything?
Yeah. Just the biggest crybaby. Oh, you guys didn't implement your requirements. Wow. No.
Yeah.
No, I just sort of ended up, I think it's a fitting title because as the years went by, people who've been paying attention to the ecosystem, when this all first started circa 2019, 2020, the DoD was just on a relentless, multiple times a day, every day of the week for months on end, awareness tour, letting people know what was going on, letting them know what the problem was, letting them know what the requirements were, blah, blah, blah. And you could literally spend all day, every day, going from webinar to event, and it would be somebody different from the DoD all down the same. It was amazing. Mm-hmm. But as things shifted in 2021, the administrations changed and they dialed back their verbal intensity around CMMC. And as people moved on and changed positions, their public outreach just completely dropped off. And in that drop off, I started making content, and just over time started being the content guy,
being the crier.
And after a while, DoD would put out some new memo or strategy doc or rule update or something, and they wouldn't say anything. So I started posting about it and, making videos about it. And then pretty soon it just sort of became like the proxy town crier for this program. It wasn't what I set out to do, but when they when they stopped talking, I just was the only one left talking about it. And now here we are, awesome. A couple of years later.
Wow.
So,
well, you said we would get to introductions, and we probably should start with, I think the definition of introduction is what you start with.
Right.
Which we didn't do because we've been sitting in sessions all day that have been really awesome.
Oh, the show's been great.
Yeah. Just so for everyone who's listening, we are in San Antonio right now at MFG 2025, which is an event that the AMT puts on, and they just put kind of like what's happening right now, what we should be aware of, like the who's who in the manufacturing community tends to be here, and you listen to a lot of great sessions and do a lot of great networking. And that's when Paul was like, hey, if we're going to record
on the list of speakers, I'm like, we need to get this guy on the show.
Exactly. So that's where so there's the introduction. So Jacob, maybe you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I'm Jacob Horne, and my title is Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist for a company called Summit 7.
Okay.
We are an outsourced IT services, cybersecurity services company, and we specifically work with defense contractors to facilitate their contractual cybersecurity requirements in their DoD contracts, specifically with the Microsoft tech stack. So most defense contractors are relatively small. They all have pretty intense cybersecurity requirements, and just economically, that means that they're probably going to outsource those services. And we are an outsourced service provider. But unlike a lot of outsourced service providers, we just focus on that defense space with those specific defense requirements. We've got about 1,000 clients of all sizes across the industrial base. As of this recording, 20 of them have their CMMC certification. And then we actually just announced earlier today that we went through our official CMMC certification and got our level 2. So we are also a defense contractor. Yeah.
Nice. Cool.
So we eat our own dog food. We operate in the same environment that we help set people up in. And we've been doing that for years and years. So Chief Evangelist basically means I don't have a sales quota, like we were talking about before we started recording. Like, I don't sell anything. I don't pitch anything on stage. My entire job is just to be the town crier, let everybody know what's going on, and to translate all the regulatory mumbo jumbo into mostly human understandable language. And yes, that's what I do now. I mean, I've been in cybersecurity now for 18 years. I started out in the Navy. I was actually stationed here in San Antonio as a cryptologic technician at NSA Texas, which is about 5 minutes from here. And did blue team work, did a bunch of cool stuff.
What's blue team? Sorry.
Blue team is cyber defense work. Oh, cool. So they kind of color code their work, as red team is kind of going in and trying to do offensive work. They're trying to break in. Usually is like a test and verification thing. They're like, hey, we can prove that we were able to hack in or got you to click on the email. Gotcha. Blue team's the opposite. They're trying to find that kind of activity. Cool. The two of them together, sometimes referred to, you guessed it, a purple team.
All right.
They're not very original. Are just various ways of chopping up, cybersecurity type work. So I did blue team for the Navy, did some cool stuff for NSA, and had a good time. I was working on a cybersecurity operations watch floor, sort of 24/7 watch floor stuff early on. So I was in the technical world for a long time, and then, like we were talking about earlier, found out that for some strange reason, I just really like reading rule books.
Tell everyone your superpower. You're a superhero. That's the thing. we don't have a lot of superheroes on the pod, but we do have one today.
Man, yeah. So my worst superpower in the history of superpowers is I can read regulations and rule books and NIST documents and not get bored. So on board game night, I'm always the rule book guy. All that stuff. And so it always just seemed like a quirk. But then as soon as all these weird, dusty federal side regulations started spilling out into the Muggle world, they needed somebody who could translate them. And that's kind of what I ended up doing. And so not what I thought I was going to be doing.
Okay. But, so when you say translate it, I'm going to back you way up.
Sure.
Because I've heard of CMMC.
Yeah.
And in like 2018, 2019, I asked my IT company, like, I might have to deal with this someday. Will you look into it? He looked into it. He's like, I don't even really understand it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't do defense work, so I guess I don't currently have to worry about it. Let's start there. What is it? And I know there's like level 1, like you just talked about, level 2. Where are people supposed to be? Like those basics.
Yeah. So the easiest way to understand it is CMMC is a Department of Defense program that's designed to verify if defense contractors have implemented the cybersecurity requirements that they agreed to in their contracts.
Okay.
At a very, very high level, that's what the program does.
So it's already in their contracts they have.
That's the squeeze, right? Okay. So this story goes way, way back, like all the way back to like 2009, 2010 era, when the DoD first started having to really deal with their unclassified data, but was still very sensitive. So we're at a manufacturing conference. There's a lot of sensitive technical data that is not classified, but the DoD would really rather not have get compromised. And starting around 2010, there were intrusions by Chinese threat actors, specifically one called Titan Rain, in the supply chain. And the DoD is like, we got a problem on our hands. We don't have any requirements for our contractors to actually protect this data, but we have to protect the data. So we've got to put the same requirements when it's outside the government as when it's inside the government. So they created a regulation through a process known as rulemaking, which we can talk about later. And they created a contract clause, and they said, if you handle our unclassified data and its technical specifications, blueprints, drawings, things like that, everything that companies in the manufacturing space would be the most familiar with, you have to implement these controls, these cybersecurity requirements. The problem was they didn't really say very much about it, and there was no mechanism to prove that you did it.
It was all self-enforced, self-assessed.
Yeah. So if you put your lawyer hat on, what ends up happening is by accepting the terms of that clause, you are making an official statement to the government that you have implemented those controls, and your rates that you are charging to the government are supposed to reflect the work that you've been doing. So this piled up for years and years and years. All these statements over time, the government is, according to their understanding, getting the work that they're paying for. And as you might guess, that work wasn't actually being done.
Sure.
So fast forward to 2015, and the Office of Personnel Management gets hacked by the Chinese Ministry of State Security. This is when they made off with all the clearance data. Well, the part that didn't get in the news was all the unclassified data that was also compromised through contractors to OPM.
Mm-hmm.
So there was big emergency, right? It was at the time, largest data compromise in the history of the federal government.
Wow.
And so they went into emergency rulemaking to update this contract clause, and they updated the requirements to point to a document called NIST Special Publication 800-171. It's a much more streamlined, it's actually a smaller number of requirements than the version they had in 2013. They expanded to say, hey, if you have an incident, we can come investigate because it's our data. If you put our data in the cloud, you have some additional requirements. They really beefed up what was going on. Usually only ever after something bad happens, right? Problem was still no mechanism to verify if you are actually doing this. So can you guess what happened? Everybody's still saying that they're doing it,
Sure.
and they're getting allegedly paid for the work, and the controls aren't getting implemented.
So they're getting paid for doing the CMMC requirement.
Well, so this is the thing.
NIST.
CMMC doesn't exist yet.
Okay,
this is all pre-CMMC.
what was this called then?
NIST 800-171.
Yeah, this is all.
Sure, I'll remember.
Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as DFARS.
I got it.
DFARS, yeah.
DFARS clauses are DoD's specific contract clauses when they do acquisitions.
So if I'm quoting a job to the government, I'm adding something in there for all the headache I have to go through.
Yeah, exactly. So like your overhead rates, your overhead rates are supposed to account for, all your overhead G&A, all this stuff, right? And you've got 1,000 different DFARS clauses in these solicitations. Like you're going to not use counterfeit parts, and you're not going to use labor from the Congo, and you're going to implement security, and you're going to do this. So you go down this list and you're like, yeah, like it totally makes sense. What you don't realize is that one cybersecurity clause is just this huge rabbit hole that points to a NIST document, that points to a series of controls, that points to a series of verification procedures, that has scoping guidance and all this stuff. It would be like if you had a contract clause that says you're going to pay your taxes and you just never looked at the tax code.
Right, sure.
Right? There's this whole other world down there. So anyways, 2016 comes by, they revise this contract clause. So now we've got 3 to 5 years of people being like, we're doing it. And then 2019 comes around, and it's publicly revealed that multiple DoD weapon systems, specifically a hypersonic missile launched off of submarines called Sea Dragon, the F-22, the F-35, are all compromised as a result of contractors in the supply chain having unclassified data get compromised and taken off, and then you can then reverse engineer some of the classified capabilities of these platforms. So the DoD gets pissed. I mean, they get super mad.
How did they discover that it was compromised in the first place? How did they know?
So they haven't ever revealed how they figured it out, but
someone got hit by a missile in the
I don't know if there was actually a kinetic event, but there's ways that they discover that these things are happening, usually through intelligence community reporting and stuff like that. So one way or another, they found out. Sure. And that's a really big problem because geopolitically, the Chinese military is not designed to go toe-to-toe with the U.S. military. It's designed to prevent the U.S. Navy from stopping an invasion of Taiwan. So when you hand the world's largest submarine fleet a hypersonic missile launched from submarines, it's a real problem. Mm-hmm. So the Senate Armed Services Committee finds out. They tell the DoD Inspector General, go evaluate DoD contractors and find out what's going on. DoD Inspector General goes out into the ecosystem and they go, okay, you've had these contract clauses for years now. You've attested that you're doing it. We've paid you to do it. Let's see if you actually did it. And they found out nobody was doing anything. So then the Senate Armed Service Committee is like, what the hell's going on out here? Like, not only have they agreed to do this, they aren't doing it. And now there's been direct harms that we can't even really talk about in public as a result of them not even really trying. So they wrote language into the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act, and they said, come up with a framework to hold contractors accountable so that they will prove that they have implemented these requirements. And that is now what we call the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. And this gets CMMC. And so this gets announced in 2020. And because the DoD was very aware of what was going on, and the DoD was very upset, and the Senate Armed Services Committee was very upset, what it appeared to industry was these random people from DoD showed up and started talking a lot of trash they got real aggressive. They were like, you are a liability to the lethality of the department. We don't want to do work with you. You screwed us. I mean, they were very aggressive because it had compromised some serious capabilities for the department. But because nobody ever really knew what they were signing in their contracts, this was coming out of the blue. Granted, this was coming out of the blue to contractors. And at the time, I was working at the NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnership, specifically the center out of California. And manufacturers were like, what are they taught? Like, what is going on? Like, screw these people. Like, it was very, very tense, right? So this all happened right at the end of 2020. And an election happens, administration changes over, new appointees come in, so on and so forth. The program gets put into review. A bunch of appointees get sent on their way. New leadership comes in. All the rhetoric calms down. And people basically go, we fought City Hall. We won. The program is paused. It's not happening. Gotcha. And a lot of contractors, as a result, when they hear you have requirements, and they hear we're doing CMMC, they associated CMMC with imposing the requirements.
Right.
But remember, the program is there to verify. It's not making you do the requirements. It's making sure
Those
you did.
Those have been there for
and you
years.
still have them. And so the DoD is basically got their hands tied behind their back, and they're watching the industrial base go, well, if you don't come make me prove it, I'm not going to do it. And they really aren't allowed to say anything while it's going under review. So at the end of 2021, they announce CMMC 2.0, and everybody goes, oh, it's back. Except in order to make it real, they had to go through more rulemaking in order to have a second regulation that outlines the details and all the stuff out of the review. And rulemaking is a process that takes a long time. And so we didn't end up getting the final version of this updated CMMC program in effect until December of 2024. So that entire time, DoD's not talking about it. People think that it went away. And in that interim period is when we sort of became town crier content people, because we were like, listen, rulemaking takes a long time, but because they came out of that review and they said, we're doing rulemaking again, that means it is inevitable. Like, it will 100% happen. The time where the program was really under threat was 2021. Because if we got to the end of 2021 and they said, no, don't worry about it, then it would have been over. But because they didn't do that, they zigged instead of zagged. Everybody's been living on borrowed time. That program went into effect at the end of December. And now the only thing that we're waiting for is the other shoe to drop when they start putting it into contracts, which is going to happen summer 2025. And
is that the 48 ruling?
Yeah. So I know we're covering a lot here on the history. So it's one program implemented by two regulations. So you have the policy itself, the levels to the program, who's responsible for what, how waivers work, which controls you're allowed to have as exceptions, and all the details of how the policy of the program works is one regulation. Anything that you put into a contract clause is considered its own regulation. So you have to have a second one for that. So they created this program, they went through rulemaking, they made it the existing policy in December. Now they're going to take all that information and they're going to condense it down into one line in your contract that says, go get CMMC level 1, 2, or 3. And if you don't get it, you can't take award of this contract. So that will happen in the summer of 2025 based off our analysis. So yeah, this thing that's going to show up in contracts in 2025 is the result of an event that happened in 2019 when they found out that people hadn't been implementing requirements that were originally in their contracts in 2013.
Right.
So what are the basic requirements?
Sure.
I mean, if you just boil it down to simple.
Yeah. So the majority of the requirements are things that people would probably be familiar with, even if they aren't really familiar with cybersecurity. Most of them are just evergreen things, like people inside your network only have access privileges to the things that they need. One thing that manufacturers do a lot is not everybody in your company has administrator level access to every computer in your network.
So, Mike, I just made you a super admin on the MakingChips Google Drive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, when you're handling, the key thing to remember here is that these requirements apply when you're handling the government's data.
Right.
And so it's a little tricky because manufacturers will often get work from the government and they will generate data. But because of the language in the contract, the government actually owns that data, not you. And so if you don't have direct rights over...
So if I have to develop my own CAD model based on what the government wants me to make for them, it's that CAD model is their data?
It depends. It depends on the language. I hate to give you an it depends answer.
Sure,
I've actually had to learn a lot about how lawyers think. Because it really depends on what's in the contract. Now, I didn't know this when I started in the field, but it's apparently a long-standing debate is something called rights in technical data. And when you do work for the government and you develop technologies, it is very common that you do not own what you create. And unless you have some high-powered lawyers that are willing to negotiate IP rights over what you do, if you're a build-to-print shop, if you're a small machine shop, if you're a processing house, if the government wants to, they can claw all that information back. And regardless, they can easily say, hey, this is covered data that you're generating pursuant to our original requirements, whatever. So when that happens, which happens quite often for manufacturers, is stuff like multi-factor authentication, right? The kind of thing that your bank typically these days kind of makes you do. You got to log in and they send you a code, or you got to log in, you got to verify with some other factor. A lot of these requirements are things like that. So they're not really the most technically insane.
It's good practice.
So a lot of it is good practice. Now, I'm going to say that in the sense that somebody who's familiar with cybersecurity generally looks at these requirements and they go, these aren't really all that crazy. If you are a machine shop owner, if you are president of a company and you don't have that background, you're probably going to look at these requirements and you're going to go, I have no idea what you're talking about. As is in the same way that you might look at a building code regulation and be like, I don't know what this means.
Right.
Or the tax code, or the legal code, or anything else. And, it is its own world, it's its own domain of skills and things like that. I wouldn't say that any of them are completely insane, outlandish, or overbearing, especially because this set of requirements in that document, 800-171, has not changed since they were the requirements in 2016. Like, there is a good case to be made that additional controls should be added, that additional requirements should be added. Actually, in 2020,
10-year-old tech, right?
Yeah. So now some stuff is evergreen, right? Like least privilege is least privilege, separation of duties is separation of duties, MFA is MFA. Maybe the technologies themselves, multi-factor authentication.
Oh, yeah.
So originally the original conception of multi-factor authentication was if you log in, you get a code on your phone. Yeah. Now there's very advanced versions of that.
Click all those pictures with the street sign.
Prove you're a human, stuff like that. Yeah, there's a bunch of there's like standalone devices that give you codes, out of band, and all that stuff. All the requirement would say would be use MFA whenever you're accessing systems with this data. It's not going to tell you use phone-based MFA or this based MFA. So if you look at it, you go, well, maybe I know what MFA is, maybe I don't. I don't know the details of solutions, how to buy them, how to implement them, how to maintain them, and all that. So what's happened over time is when 75% of the companies in the supply chain are 100 people or less, and when 3/4 of the supply chain don't have internal IT folks and they don't have security folks and they don't know what any of this stuff means, you're in a real pickle, because you have a minimum set of kind of evergreen requirements that have never changed, that anybody who kind of knows what they're looking at would say, this is really the baseline that you should be doing. But if people are below, there's a concept called the cyber poverty line. If you're below a certain level of internal skill, internal resources, internal budget, there is no way for you to just watch some YouTube videos and learn how to do it. You need the external assistance. And that's a problem because these aren't new requirements. People had been attesting to them. So we're in a real kind of standoff here, because the government says you can't handle this data if you can't put in the requirements to protect it. Sure. And you told us that you were protecting it all along. So it's perfectly reasonable for them to be like, if you can't protect it, you don't get the data. If you do that, you shut down the industrial base, because most people can't do it. So what do you do? Right? And that's kind of where we're at.
And Paul, you guys have made lots of strides with ProShop to be.
We've built a lot of features specifically for our customers to help them, like adding MFA and adding least privilege and adding lots of auditing and other such things. So I wanted to ask a couple questions, because I've been watching the supply chain over the last many years saying, it's, they went from 1.0, they went to 2.0, they really know what they're doing. They're just going to wipe it away at some point, and I know you know this better than anybody, but can you, I guess, maybe it's not reassuring to most, but reassure us it is not actually going to go away.
Yeah, it will 100%. It is 100% not going away at all.
And some people thought that maybe with the new administration coming in and getting rid of all this regulation and DOJ that they would just, but
yeah, it is a fair question, right? It's 100% a perfectly reasonable question, as long as. So there's sort of two things that come with it. As long as when people hear the answer, they immediately don't dismiss it, because it's something that we look at very closely. I'll tell you a good signal of it not happening is if you see me suddenly change jobs, right? Because it's literally all we do is based off this regulation. We make it our business to go pretty deep into understanding the background, the players, what's going on. You've seen the podcast. We've got hours-long videos on how rulemaking works. So
what is the podcast?
So Sum It Up is our podcast. We do it every Thursday, and we talk about any current events that are going on with CMMC,
so Summit,
cyber, get it? Yeah, Summit 7, Sum It Up.
Yeah, so Summit like a mountain.
Yeah, we got it.
Cool.
And we do.
I'm helping the audience.
Yeah, we do a
Mike
live.
Finally got it. I could see.
Took me a minute.
I could see the light bulb pop up.
We do a live Q&A every Friday. It's like I was going to talk about tomorrow at the presentation. This story now goes back 15 years. There's massive government programs, there's cybersecurity issues, there's legal issues, regulatory issues, there's all this stuff, but the sessions at conferences are all still 45 minutes long, and you still need 15 minutes of Q&A. So you're just running out of time to describe what's going on when people are starting at zero. And so we basically just started a show every week where we just do Q&A. There's a phone number you can call. There's a form online, cuihotline.org. And
you just ask a question.
And you can ask any question. We do it live, and it's everything from specific, highly technical Microsoft questions to the most obscure, high-level policy questions and everything in between. It's really a lot of fun. But
Mike calls in. He's like, "Are the pictures of me leading yoga at MFG 20? Are they going to get hacked off my phone?"
Yeah.
That's classified information.
Only because no one wants to see that.
So yeah, it's been really interesting. Actually, some of the most interesting content that we have put out, I'd say over the last couple of years, has been in response to people being like, this is the thing that's going to kill CMMC. And we've had to go down the rabbit hole of researching what is that and will it or not. And so one big example in the Supreme Court's recent decisions, they overturned something called Chevron deference. And I ended up having to do a bunch of research. We had a podcast with a legal scholar to explain to us the 40-year paradigm in the Supreme Court about Chevron deference. Wow. Apparently, this is a thing that came out where when executive branch agencies create regulations, if those regulations are not tied directly to legislation passed by Congress, the Supreme Court would defer to the agencies to interpret what the regulation ought to be. So the EPA would be able to interpret what the Clean Air Act meant when they're issuing pollution regulations, even though the Clean Air Act didn't say that specific thing. And obviously, over time, that became less and less popular because the regulation started increasing. It's not a political show, but what was the reason that was happening was when people would challenge the regulations, the Supreme Court would defer to the agencies under a case back in the day, which was Chevron versus somebody. So this was like 40 years of precedent in the Supreme Court, and a lawsuit came up where I think the state of Washington passed a regulation that said, we want to protect fisheries. We don't want you to overfish. And so we're going to have an observer on the fishing boats to make sure that you're not exceeding your catch, but you got to pay for it. Oh, and wow. So the fishing industry sued them and been like, where's that law? And obviously that's not in the law. So it ended up going all the way to Supreme Court, and they said, we're no longer going to defer to agencies. And my LinkedIn inbox blew up where people were like, Chevron got overturned, so CMMC is dead, because CMMC is a regulation that an agency created and they're not allowed to do that anymore. So we had to go down the rabbit hole, and we're like, well, actually, it's a procurement regulation, and the OFPP is the thing that governs procurement regulations, not the Administrative Procedures Act. And you have to have a lawsuit. And the FY20 NDAA had specific language that said create a framework. So there is a tie-in, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we've gone literally years of these examples. The most recent one has been the election. And they're like, well, this is a big anti-regulatory environment. People forget this was a Trump era rule under the first Trump administration when there was an executive order that said for every regulation you issue, you need to rescind 2 regulations. This is probably the least favorable environment for regulation in recent history. And they actually jammed out CMMC with a waiver to the regulatory process. Normally what happens in the regulatory process is if you're going to issue regulation, you have to draft it, you have to put it out for public comment, you have to adjudicate all those public comments, you have to run it back through internal review, and then you get to publish a final rule, which is why it takes 2+ years. There's a waiver that they can get, and they can put it out as an interim final rule, which says when the agency publishes it, this is now a regulation. You don't get to comment on it. There's no review. So in that first anti-regulatory environment, the Trump administration said, interim final rule. It's a threat to national security because Sea Dragon got compromised.
Sure.
The Chinese J-31 is about 70% of the F-35.
I was going to say that.
Right?
That's one of the ways they know it got hacked.
Yeah.
Their plane looks almost this
identical. Yeah. And the trick, right, is they don't need the F-35. They don't need the exact F-35. What's happening is if you get enough of this unclassified data for free with zero consequence, you can reverse engineer a 70% version for pennies on the dollar, and you got 1,000 of them, and it doesn't matter what the F-35 is capable of. If you got hypersonic missiles launching out of their submarines and 1,000 pretty good F-35s, you're not stopping an invasion of Taiwan. And so it's a weird story because you're talking about, hey, please implement multi-factor authentication. And then if people go, why do I need to do that? You're like, do you want to lose the war? And it just goes into this huge story.
Do you love your family?
Yeah, it can get really hyperbolic pretty quickly. Fast forward to where we are right now. There's several reasons why CMMC is not going away, right? The first is it's a Trump era rule. It was one of the few Trump era rules that made it through an anti-regulatory environment in the first place. Russ Vought is now the head of OMB, the Office of Management Budget. Guess who was the head of OMB who makes the decision about which rules get interim final status or not under Trump 1? It was Russ Vought. There's some other people who are now appointees inside the DoD who were allies and defenders of the program beforehand, the most prominent of which was Katie Arrington.
Yeah,
Katie Arrington just got her job back. She is now the CISO of DoD. And if anybody remembers the CMMC 1.0 days, 2019 to 2020, she is the face of the program specifically, and she got run out of town under the Biden administration. Make of that what you will. And now she's back. And allegedly, a lot of people who are getting their jobs back from the first administration are asking, where the hell is our rule? Mm-hmm. Well, we had a national security emergency and we went through all the hoops to get the interim final rule pushed out through all the red tape against regulation. What have you been doing for 4 years? Mm-hmm. A good example of this is DoD has very limited internal capacity to assess contractors directly. Part of the reason why they're using third-party companies,
network.
Yeah, the C3PAOs, is because DoD can't hire
C3PAO.
C3PAO stands for.
I thought it was.
It's a certified third-party assessment organization, right? CMMC third-party assessment organization is C3PAO.
Okay.
So these are the companies that you hire to come bring their auditors in to verify that you've done the requirements. Okay. They're accredited by a company called the Cyber AB, and then that is what gives you your certification status against the level.
You can't self-certify. You have to bring someone in to prove it. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So we can maybe talk about the self-certification thing here in a second. So they are basically, from my understanding, they came back in when the administration switched over and they went, what the hell have you been doing for 4 years? When they sent their auditors out over the last 4 years, people were self-assessing and they were calculating their compliance score. They were uploading it into the system. And when they would see perfect scores come through, they would call those companies up and they'd be like, hey, we'll be there tomorrow. And they would check out the scores, and typically what would happen, according to them, is the score would drop by 100 points, where they were 100% not correct scores. So the DoD basically said, we got a serious problem. We know you didn't implement the controls. We're going to come up with a program that's going to make sure that you implemented the controls. And people said, make me. And then 4 years went by, and the DoD was like, please implement the controls. Every time they went to check, they were like, these are not implemented. And now the band is back together and they're pretty pissed. And that's where we are. So right. I hope everybody's been implementing their controls.
Yeah. Well, we know that they haven't been, and we know it's not going away. So we have thousands of vendors, and I'd love to have you talk a little bit about how it flows down all the way to processors and such, and what the reality is of that happening. So starting in this summer of 25, they're expecting to have it go into contracts.
Yep.
You have 20 customers that have passed CMMC audits, but there's not enough C3PAOs. There's going to be a very long waiting list.
Yep.
Even, for the companies that haven't done enough yet to even get on the waiting list. What is the reality of, you think, going to happen over the next 6 months, 9 months, year?
Yeah. So you're going to have a huge rush of people that are going to try to get certified all at once. And it's going to be like people trying to jam through the door all at once. It's going to be a massive traffic jam. And I think everybody knows that's going to happen. And the thing is that's not a reason to not start the assessments, right? So it is a trade-off to doing the assessments. Is there won't be enough assessment capacity at the start of the program. So that kind of results in two different things. The first is a lot of people are worried about there not being enough assessment capacity, and they're using that to justify continued inaction and non-compliance.
Sure.
You cannot worry about a lack of assessment capacity if everyone in the ecosystem couldn't even qualify for an assessment because they haven't implemented the controls. So we've called this phenomenon a CMMC false start. So part of the assessment process is when you call up a C3PAO to do your assessment, they're going to do some like basic sanity checking to make sure that it passes the smell test and make sure that you can actually go through the assessment. If you haven't implemented the controls, if you can't answer some basic questions, you won't even qualify. You literally couldn't pay them.
Yeah,
to
they'll
go
just rule you
on their
out.
schedule.
You just won't qualify to get it, right? And so what will actually end up happening is there won't be very many failures of CMMC at all, because the only people who will qualify to get through the assessment are the ones who can obviously make it. It'll be all the early adopters.
Yeah, you're like pre-qualified for your mortgage, once you're there,
all the people with the
you're
best,
going to get the money.
Literally all the people with the best credit scores are the ones who are at the front of the line because they know that they can pass.
Yeah, wow.
So what ends up happening is you're going to have all these companies stuck in this long traffic jam. And I think everybody knows that that's going to happen. The bet that you're making, though, is that enough people ahead of you won't get through the traffic jam such that the DoD has enough people that they need to give you special status later on, right?
But if we just said that you're basically pre-qualified by even getting in the line in the first place, then why do they think a lot of people are going to fail the C3PAO?
It's not that they won't. Well, one, they know that the requirements aren't implemented. So typically for a lot of companies, the process of going from zero to what I would call assessment ready can sometimes take 12 to 18 months.
Wow.
And they're really not technological limits, right? It's not a technology thing. We can go, you guys know, you go as fast as you want to from the technology stance. It's where's the data? Who needs access to the data? Do you have the budget? Is this a priority? Are they on vacation? Where's engineering on this? Can we get the sign-offs and all this? There's a bunch of stuff that has to happen for companies to implement the requirements before you get to the part of proving that you have implemented the requirements. So the DoD just released a memo very recently that takes the language in the CMMC regulation and summarizes it for the contract workforce, to the contracting officers, to the program managers doing procurements. And it has guidance in there on what the waiver process will look like. And they in there say the only people who can approve a waiver are a service acquisition executive. There are like 9 of those people in the DoD. And in order for a waiver to get approved by a service acquisition executive, it first has to go through the CIO of the service. So the CIO of the Navy has to approve a waiver, and then the service acquisition executive for the Navy has to approve the waiver. On top of that, the waivers are for contracts. They are not for individual contractors. So the Navy has to decide ahead of time, there aren't enough companies for us to be able to meet this program requirement. So all of these companies are going to be exempted from having to prove that they have implemented the requirements.
For a period of time.
For a period of time. It's a temporary waiver. Now that might happen at the start when there aren't very many companies that have made it through the traffic jam, but that will obviously be pretty rare. And as more companies make it through the traffic jam, there will be less and less need for them to go through that process. So the further back in line you are, the more you're hoping that your competitors are not ahead of you in line. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
and you may know this, but if you had to guess, how many manufacturers out there need to be certified.
If you're a manufacturer doing DoD work, I would be surprised if you can get away from not doing this.
But do you have any speculation of what that number is?
What does the line look like?
Yeah, so it's at least 80,000 companies.
Okay.
It's at least 80,000.
That's for level 2.
For level 2, 800, 171. There's 3 levels. Level 3 is going to affect a very small number of companies. Level 1 is not a certification. It really, honestly, I wouldn't even worry about it for our purposes here. Level 2 is the thing that's going to affect manufacturers. The reason I say at least 80,000 is because the DoD doesn't know. The government is actually not allowed to ask you things unless they issue a regulation that is approved for them to ask you things under something called the Paperwork Reduction Act.
Oh.
So they literally are not allowed to ask you how many suppliers you have. They're going to give you their covered data or pay you to generate their covered data, and they're not allowed to ask you who you send it to. So the way they get around that is these contract clauses have flow down mechanisms. So a lot of manufacturers, quality managers, they'll be familiar with this. So they'll say, hey, when you send our data to whoever you're sending it to that we're not allowed to ask, you have to send this contract language with that data, and they have to do it, and they have to do it however far down the supply chain this data goes. But they can't see past that first tier. So it's at least 80,000, but it's in reality, it's a lot more than that.
So let's call it 80. How many are currently at tier level 2? Is that level
currently 2? Certified at level 2? Maybe 100.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, maybe 100.
So we've got a big gap.
Yeah, you got a big problem.
So does that mean there's 100 companies serving the DoD that have like a unique advantage and maybe pricing power that comes with it?
Oh yeah.
So if you did all your homework and you had all your ducks in the row, then you can kind of pick and choose.
You have a real competitive
If you get through the system first. So this is what happens. Those 20 companies that we work with, every one of those companies has said, we know our competitors are going to be stuck in line, and they were going to take forever to get this cert. They're going to have to pay a huge premium to jump the line. They may not even be able to jump the line.
So you can get the exact work you want.
And so we're going to bid on it, and they're going to have to get an exception. They're going to have to get special treatment where they're going to be more difficult to do business with, and we don't have to worry about it because we did what we were supposed to do. And maybe the DoD decides that they're going to do it. Maybe they don't. The problem is that you don't know. You can't predict how much does the DoD care in this situation or that situation. How much does this contract officer care in this situation or that situation? I'll give you a good example. I was talking with some folks on a break at the event, and there's a 100-person company, and they know exactly what's going on. Their CEO understands the program. CEO is bought in. They took a long time to get ready because they only have one IT guy, but they're chipping away at what's going on. They have a direct relationship with their prime. Their prime is like, hey, we know this is coming. This is when we expect it to happen. We know that your rates are going to go up. We're totally fine with that. This is when we think you need to be ready. We got your back. And they were happy as a clam. He was the happiest guy I've ever met when I talked about CMMC. And I was like, wow, that's a crazy story, man. I was like, do you realize that a lot of your competitors like don't even think that this is happening because the program got paused in 2020 and they just stopped paying attention? He's like, why would they think that? This is a real story. This happened just a couple hours ago. He's like, why would they think that? I was like, I don't know, man. I have a job making content because they think that.
Gosh.
So that company is going to do amazing things.
Yeah. It kind of the overall takeaway here for the shop like Hill or any shop who either does or aspires to serve the DoD is like, if you've already been doing this, good
Massive
on you.
advantage.
You have a huge advantage. And if you haven't been doing this, you should have been doing this.
Yeah.
So you should start now.
Yeah. You have a massive advantage for doing the thing you said you were doing all along. Right?
Wow.
How long do you think it'll take for that to go to flow down through the supply chain?
Hard to know. I think it'll, because the way that it rolls out is it isn't like they're going to send up a balloon and they're going to go, everybody everywhere needs to do this thing. It'll come out when contracts come up for solicitation. And so it depends on how many suppliers there are and what's going on. It's not going to be.
Do you see the log jam getting longer or smoothing out?
It's hard to know. Hard to know. And I think it depends on the sector. So for instance, like we heard from the Blue Forge guy, and I think that certain places like the submarine industrial base can be very tuned into what's going on. Missile Defense Agency, very tuned into their low-level small suppliers. If you're downstream from a system that's more commoditized and there's a lot of redundancy, then maybe they don't reach out to you quite as much. So when I've talked to people at the big primes, the RTXs, the Northrops, the Lockheeds, every one of them has said, yeah, we know who our absolutely most critical suppliers are that we cannot afford to lose. and we have helped them out and they're going to be just fine. And I go, well, what about everybody else? And they go, what about everybody else?
So as far as help them out, like helped them make
money,
sure they were compliant?
Money, equipment, understanding, training. They took care of them to make sure that everything was good to go.
Because they rely on them so much.
So my advice to people is if you do work for Lockheed and you have not heard from Lockheed on this specific issue, then you maybe are not quite as critical as you think you are, and you need to call them immediately.
Well, I am curious because, we have clients that serve many primes, and some of them have said that some of the primes are just all up in their business.
Yeah.
And other primes are just like sending them a form. It's like, fill this out.
And that's a good example of how
the more up in their business they are, that's probably a good thing.
It's the better, yeah. It also just gives you, everybody talks about demand signals in the industrial base. I mean, this is the demand signal, right? So I'd say that is a good example of the variance that you'll see in terms of how much does any given program or program officer care on any given thing that you're working on downstream, and it's not easy to predict. The odds of every program manager that you work downstream from, of every program, being like, we don't really care, we'll fill out the waivers, we'll do this, we'll do that. If you get even one of these things that comes through that says you have to get the certification and you can't afford to skip out on that work, then you can't afford to hope that you're going to get a waiver or an exception, or that it's going to go away, or that it's going to do
So I
this.
remember back to like when my wife and I had been dating for a while, and all of a sudden she started asking all these questions and wanting to know kind of how much money was in the account and what the plans were for the house and also
the Ferrari was a rental or not.
It was really annoying, but that was just a signal that she was like, "Hey, can I marry this guy?" Or
well,
not?
I'll give you the example, right? So when I worked at the NIST MEP program, I got brought in as a cybersecurity consultant, and that's a program that's run specifically to help small manufacturers, in that situation, defense manufacturers. And I, at that time, learned a bunch about quality systems because you would go into these environments and they don't have IT people, they don't have security people, but they have quality managers. So I always ended up talking to quality managers. And the presentation I'm giving on Friday is based off of using your quality management system as a framework for tackling your cybersecurity 100%. Requirements. Because the way that I describe it is this whole cybersecurity thing, even if you don't know the details about any of it, the way that manufacturers can tackle it the best is to treat it as an outsourced special process, right? So in the security world, there's this big debate about compliance not equaling security. Compliance is not security. So get a little esoteric for you real quick. So people go, compliance isn't security. And my favorite question to ask them is, what is security? Like, if this set of things that I do is not equal to security, what is equal to security? And they don't know because you can't prove security. I can only point to security when it fails.
Sure.
Right? It's very easy to know when it doesn't work.
The only thing you could prove is insecurity.
Yeah. Well, what does that sound like? That's exactly like, it's exactly like a special process. I don't know if this process that I went, I don't know if this weld works until it fails or until I take it apart. And so I have to continuously monitor this process, and I have to go through what is essentially a very strict compliance regime to ensure that it is actually happening. Yeah. That's the only way that we're going to be able to get through what's going on. So CMMC, cybersecurity, the only thing that manufacturers need to think about is this CMMC process is a NADCAP accreditation because cybersecurity is a special process. So imagine a situation where you do some sort of special treatment as a special process, but you get to self-certify that your special process is good to go. No NADCAP, no audit checklist, no nothing. And then your aerospace parts go onto a platform and something horrific happens. And the government turns around and they go, we're not going to let you self-certify that special process anymore. You have to pay NADCAP to come in with their third-party auditor and run through a very detailed checklist to prove that you're managing this correctly. And you turn around and go, I should still be able to self-certify. I don't think this is going to happen. I can't afford to refactor my company. You're being unreasonable. This is ridiculous. That is what's going on with CMMC. This was a self-certified special process that wasn't working. Something catastrophic happened. Now the government has said,
well, I mean, look at the Chinese plane, right? Like, this is why we can't have nice things.
It's not exactly the same, but it's like, okay, your self-certified special process component on the F-35 or the data that creates that special component, well, you are no longer able to not get a third-party system. And when you think about it that way, the light bulb goes off, in my experience, for quality managers like crazy. Because if you walk through a quality system, if you're an AS9100 certified company, if you're a NADCAP accredited company, this is a formality for you.
Yeah.
Because you don't necessarily do the configuration management, the change control, the special process thing that your processors are doing, but you still have to manage that interface when the data flows to them, when the components flow to them. All this stuff you have to manage, even though you don't actually do the thing. What's that like? You've paid an MSP to run this cybersecurity special process. And so when CMMC shows up, you're getting audited on your management of this interface. You don't even have to know the cybersecurity specifics. The same way that you don't know how to do the welding process specifically, you're just managing it. I think that if they had oriented CMMC around quality systems when this whole thing came out, the buy-in would have been a lot stronger. CMMC would have been mostly a formality for most companies in the DIB, especially the manufacturers. But a lot of people think that security and quality are kind of ships in the night. And I didn't know enough about quality to know that that was what people thought when I was at the MEP. I mean, it seems simple enough to me. I've seen the format work, and so that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Cool. What are the economics behind this? How much does this cost?
Yeah, so I'm not going to give you an it depends, but I will tell you this. The reason why I harp so much on emphasizing CMMC is the verification of the requirements. It is not the thing imposing the requirements. Is what people will do is they'll say, oh my God, CMMC is going to cost me $500,000. It's going to cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. No one is going to charge you hundreds of thousands of dollars to run through the verification, to run through the audit. Now, those audits are going to be expensive. Those might be anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000, depending on the complexity of your network and how big you are. That's every 3 years.
Okay.
So these
would they be kind of indirectly charging themselves because they expect you to build that into your quote? Right. The fact that you have to be compliant.
Yeah. So in the regulation.
So if they made it way too expensive or whatever, they're kind of paying for it anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, they've left the price of the audits up to market dynamics, and so this big rush at the beginning, it's going to be expensive. It'll eventually commoditize over time, like everything else. I don't know if it'll ever be as cheap as like an ISO 9001, just because cybersecurity type work is in demand and it's always more expensive than other things. But those audits themselves are going to cost. I've seen 30 to 80, depending on the size of the company, every 3 years. Now, that is the cost of your CMMC certification. That is assuming that you have implemented the requirements in the other contract clauses. And that work can be $100,000 up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on, do you need to completely digitally transform your entire company such that it can have these modern security controls? Are you going to do a complete migration from an on-premise network to a cloud native environment? I mean, how much do you want to spend? How much do you want to spend? And so I would say that the rough estimate of price for implementing the requirements, ballpark for most people, is going to be $50 to $150, and the ballpark for the certification of those requirements is going to be $30 to $80.
Okay.
Obviously, that's very blurry on the edges, but
so for it to be palatable for people, then they have to feel like, okay, it's worth it to do DoD work, and that I should see it in the margin, then, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know the history. This is still a research project for myself. I'm sure the audience probably knows better, but imagine the environment pre and post NADCAP. There's like 4,700 certain NADCAP accredited companies, because I know people who run aerospace shops, they're AS9100, but they're not NADCAP. And the cost to refactor their machine shop was like $500,000. And if you're not going to spend the $500,000 and you don't get the NADCAP accreditation, then you don't get to do the NADCAP work, because they're not going to take non-accredited parts and put them into an F-35. So if you can't get the certification that shows that you have the minimum baseline and assure the government that their data is somewhat protected, the policy is you don't get the data. Now, if you're a company where 20% of your work is DoD or this or that, you got some resources, it's not that big of a deal. If you're a company where 100%, 75% or more of your work is dependent on controlled data flows, and you've been accepting these contract clauses for years, and you haven't heard from your prime, and this is all news to you, like, you really, really need to come up with a plan, because there's a lot of companies that are in your situation, but we're in the part of that famous quote where they say there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. I mean, if the DoD was going to deviate from this plan, it would have been in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Man.
So, I think just in the macro sense, there are going to be a bunch of companies that do 5, 10, 20% work, and they just decide it's not worth, I'm just going to go to other industries.
Mm-hmm.
It's not worth the expense. So there's going to be a drop in the DIBS supply base anyway. Maybe folks that are just getting close to retirement, like this is just too much.
Yeah.
But it's going to be an opportunity for the shops that do aggressively go after it.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen that happen a lot with with demographics of people retiring. There's a lot of what I call the baby primes, where they've grown pretty rapidly. The Blue Halos of the world, some of the other companies that are based out of Southern California, where I'm at, where they've been snapping up companies and manufacturers, and they're now becoming pretty sizable companies, winning a lot of work from inheriting those books of businesses.
It might be harder to turn the Titanic, like harder to take a big company that's got all these different processes and all these different non-CMMC kind of DNA and how they've built their whole company. It might be harder to fix that than it would be to just acquire a smaller company that already has it all.
Yeah.
And so, like, if I think about you, and we've had this conversation at our company too, like maybe it would be better to acquire a shop that's already in all these markets than to try to change our entire shop into being that way.
And so I know that, a lot of manufacturers and stuff, they're busy, they're doing their thing, but if you ever get the chance, go to a private equity conference. Especially one where they've got a talk track on manufacturing, and listen to how those guys talk about what's going on and changing in the manufacturing industry. All they talk about is mergers, acquisitions. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what they're banking on. Mm-hmm. So I'll put it to you this way. There are not a lot of managed service providers that focus on this specific space because MSPs don't want to deal with compliance just like anybody else doesn't want to deal with it. It's annoying. They'd rather work with dental offices or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of companies that do what we do. There's half a dozen of us, and we're all very familiar with the private equity people because they're like, wait a minute, everyone has to do this. Everyone's going to be selling and merging and acquiring, and there's only a handful of companies that specialize in facilitating the requirements. So the big money is like watching what's going on. I'm not saying that because to say like this is to convince you to do it, but it's like the world is changing.
Sure.
The world is changing. The tide's already shifted under your feet. You just didn't notice because the lag from the time that they made the policy decision until the time that it shows up in your contract takes a while because of the red tape that it has to go through. But the decision was already made in 2021.
So I have two questions. They might be in the weeds, but they're practical for shop owners. Talk a little bit about CUI markings.
Sure.
What does that stand for?
Yeah, so
controlled unclassified information. Okay. So that would be the drawings, the 3D CAD models.
Sure. I promise I won't go take up too much time. Like I said, this is a fascinating story, honestly, because it goes back so far. So back when we were talking 2010, 2009, when the DoD was like, we got to come up with our own requirements. Literally in parallel with that, and this is a true story, in parallel with that, the government said, we've got a serious problem on our hands because all of these agencies have classified information, and we're very good about sharing classified information. There's top secret, secret confidential, there's markings, there's declassification. We've got a system for that. There's overclassification, but we know how it works. Classified is classified. If you're read in, you're read in, so on and so forth. But there's all this unclassified information, not just at DoD, at every agency that is sensitive. For instance, taxpayer information. Treasury data, to give you a relevant one from current events, right? Yeah. Asylum applications for people seeking asylum. You've got all kinds of unclassified data that have a law or a regulation that mandates that it is protected. And over time, it ended up there were 2,200 different authorities in laws and regulations that said, protect this data, protect this data, protect this data, protect this data. So all the agencies that were getting told, protect the data, said, well, how do we know if it's the data? We got to mark it. And so they all came up with their own markings. And we ended up with 170 different ways of marking unclassified data. Well, what happens if I need to send a different law enforcement agency information about unclassified terrorism reporting? And it's not marked the way that they mark it. Do they know to protect it? We can't share it. I have no idea. It was actually worse that it was unclassified. So the government came up with this idea and they said, we're going to get everybody in a room and we're going to put one agency in charge. They're going to come up with a single way of marking unclassified data the way we have single ways of marking classified data. And we're going to come up with the minimum set of requirements for protecting it. And that's going to be an umbrella term, controlled unclassified information. And so they went through and they said the National Archives is going to be in charge of this program. NARA is the name of this agency, long story. And they said, okay, go figure it out. And they took it. There were so many authorities and markings. It took them 6 years. It took them from 2010 to 2016 to say, okay, there are 125 broad categories of data that are unclassified but need to be protected. Here's how you mark them. And this is the minimum standard when you're dealing with it to protect that information inside the government or outside of the government. That standard is NIST SP 800-171. So in parallel with the DoD saying we need to protect our data, the government-wide was saying we're going to have everybody protect the data in the same way. And so this all came to a head in 2016. Now, that is back to defense manufacturers. Mm-hmm. You may or may not be getting data that is appropriately marked because the CUI,
very often not.
The CUI program is notorious for not getting followed to
by the government itself.
By the government itself. Now so the CUI program governs this whole thing, but imagine the CUI program didn't exist. The DoD in their own parallel universe here from 2010 would still have a desire to protect their technical data. They would still come up with the requirements that you need to implement. They would still come up with the CMMC program. So don't be fooled by saying, oh, the CUI program is controversial. All this stuff would still apply to you. Now, the advantage here is that, remember, CUI is just the umbrella term. Remember all those authorities that I mentioned, those 125 categories? Those all stem from laws or regulations. So the way that manufacturers can know if they have CUI, even if it's not marked, is if you get documents that have DoD distribution statements on them. So a lot of times if you go to a DoD presentation, at the bottom corner, it'll say distribution statement A, approved for public release. Well, there's distribution statements B through F, and all those distribution statements have some caveat on them, and they say not for public release, only for release for people, blah, blah, blah. There's all these rules, right? That regulation is what forms the DoD's category of CUI. We call that category controlled technical information because when NARA stopped by the DoD and said, what do you guys do for protecting information? DoD said, well, we care about all this technical information and we mark it like this. And they go, cool. Controlled technical information, mark it like this instead. And then they went down the road. So you still are getting this data, even if it's not marked as CUI.
But you need to treat it as if it were marked properly.
That is the indicator that you are dealing with CUI, even if it's not marked.
Are those statements going to be on a purchase order, a contract, an email from a procurement agent?
Yeah. So over time, you'll start to see more of the CUI markings take over, but typically you're going to see those in the purchase orders. You'll usually see them in the control box on a print. You'll see in, with like who the controlling authority is, a lot of times you'll see those distribution statements, and it is not as simple as we're just going to crop the part of the print that we care about and leave the distribution statement off. That's the easiest indicator for most manufacturers. The other big one is naval nuclear propulsion information. That's the other big one that a lot of manufacturers will end up seeing is NNPI, as it's called. But CUI is just the umbrella term for all the unclassified data across the entire government that would need to be protected. Now, the advantage is it's the same requirements for all those kinds of data no matter where you go. It's all 800-171. It's all least privilege, multi-factor, change your password, all that stuff. So they've normalized the requirements. But the way that I describe it to people is the DoD space, the DIB space, is just the canary in the coal mine because the DoD was motivated in 2010 to get ahead of this problem. The other agencies are just now starting to get motivated by this problem, but they have the advantage that the DoD did not, in that now the CUI program exists and 800-171 exists and CMMC exists because CMMC
right on it.
CMMC is a program that verifies if 800-171 is implemented. So if GSA or NASA or anybody else, if energy wants to have assurance that their contractors are implementing these requirements, they don't have to invent a program. They don't have to go through rulemaking. They don't have to go get yelled at for 3 years at various conferences. They just say, here you go. This is the government-wide requirement, and those guys will prove if you did it or not. So call us when you have it. So I would expect, to call back to your earlier question, CMMC is more likely to spread to other agencies than it is to go away.
Yeah.
You think including the private space?
Oh, yeah. So I say that to some people where they're like, we'll just go do non-DoD work. Be like, you might be able to do that for a while, but the winds are changing, right?
Yeah.
The winds are changing.
So you had one more question.
Well, I have more than one, but yeah.
Yeah, we're a little long already, but this has been really interesting.
Yeah.
Imagine when people were like, hey, you want to get on stage for 20 minutes and talk about CMMC? And you're like, I would love to. I'll get on stage for 5 minutes if you want to. But the whole thing really is interesting. And I found that over time, there's a lot of misunderstanding because the DoD did not do a great job of telling this story when they came out in 2020. They just got in people's faces and held a gun to their head and said, do these requirements and spend $100,000. Otherwise, you're going to lose your house. And it's not exactly a popular way of persuading people to your side. But when people hear this story, it doesn't necessarily make it easier, but it does generally make it make more sense. And it's not impossible. I mean, it can seem impossible when you've got this rabbit hole, this like nesting doll of regulations and stuff like that. But we've helped companies of all sizes go through it. We've helped all companies of all sizes get ready for it. It's really just one of those same situations where if you decide that I'm going to start on these requirements the day that it shows up in the solicitation that you absolutely have to win, then it might be too late at that point.
Sure. So my one question, now that you have at least 20 clients that have passed this, I presume some of them are machine shops.
Yeah.
This question of G code. They can't encrypt, CNC machines can't encrypt G code at rest or in transit between them and the machine. So what are they doing about G code?
Yeah. So the advantage here is there's actually an advantage in these like ticky-tacky kind of confusing rules, right? So when you dig under the hood, it's a lot like your accountant trying to find advantages in the tax code to lower your tax burden. If you find a compliance specialist who knows how the rules work, they can find a lot of savings for you in terms of scoping your environment, controlling your data flow, where the requirements actually apply or not. And some of the language that people take the most issue with is the language that's kind of nebulous. Like you're, man, I wish this was more specific. Like, why is this so open-ended? That is an advantage because you can make a case, be like, this is how this is interpreted. This is how it should be scoped. This is in scope. This is out of scope. This data counts. This data does not count, blah, blah, blah. This is not realized income. This is not active. We're passing this on to next year. We're doing this, we're doing that. So when it comes to G code, this falls into what's known as the CMMC scoping guide. So a lot of assets on your machine, in your machine shop, on the shop floor, are not included in your actual assessment, even though the data is flowing through those assets. And it's specifically called out in the scoping guide where that's allowed to happen and not allowed to happen. And so it just depends on how creative do you want to get with your interpretations? How much do you want to go back and forth with auditors? One of the reasons why we employ so many former DoD auditors and send all of our solution architects through auditor training is specifically so that we can win those conversations, is the way that I would put it. So we actually have more people employed at us, the service provider, than any C3PAO auditor company in the ecosystem. So all of our technical people have gone through the auditing. At one point in time, a lot of the initial auditors were auditors that had gone through the classes that I was teaching. So not to say that it's, perfectly simple. But when it comes to questions like that, manufacturers have some special considerations. I will say this, though. I've been in meetings where the DoD, a long story how I ended up getting to go to these meetings. I definitely was not qualified to be there, but I've been in meetings in Washington, D.C., where there's like a cartoonishly long meeting table. And on one side, it's all the Pentagon folks. And on the other side, it's all of the people from all the major primes. So it's all the Lockheeds and the Raytheons. And I'm like in the corner, like wondering how I got invited to this meeting, just keeping my mouth shut. And there was one time where one of the people from the Office of the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering specifically was asked the question, at what point does technical data lose its identity as controlled technical information, like when it's being decomposed into G code or whatever. And they were like, we don't know. So even at the highest echelons of the Pentagon, it is still it depends. Could it be? Could it not be? There is no specific one answer, but it is possible. It is 100% possible. But you will not open 171 and it'll be like G code is CUI, or open the CMMC scoping guide and be like G code is not CUI. It's taxes, it's legal code, it's interpretation, it's its own world, which I know that's very annoying to people because they're like, why does it need to be like that? Just push the button and make it compliant. But nothing is like that. Nothing is like that.
Sure.
So,
wow.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up. I know one thing. Machine shops are good at G code. They're not good at these other kinds of codes.
Yeah,
they need to
this stuff was way over my head for most of it, but it sounds so super simple, interesting.
Right? Sounds so simple. You're like, oh yeah, you got to implement cybersecurity and then get a cert, and then you're like, you got 4 hours.
I think from a sales and marketing perspective, naturally, because what I do, and it's like, everyone wants to do this kind of work because there's just an abundance of it, and you can make great margin on it, but there's a ticket to entry here.
Yeah, there are, regulations do create barriers.
And a lot of people have been sneaking in without the ticket, and they're going to get caught for it. So.
Yeah, regulations do create barriers to entry, but they also make it pretty great for the people who get over those barriers. So it's don't dismiss it, and keep your head on a swivel because it is 100% real.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, hey, to wrap it up, if you're not compliant, you're not making chips.
If you're not making chips,
you're not making money. Bam.